You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1983. Saturday, March 19th was gray, wet, and chilly in Redford Township near Detroit, Michigan. 19-year-old Christina Castiglione and 25-year-old Chris L. had been dating for about 8 months, and they had plans to meet up that Saturday night. Since neither one of them had a car and they lived about 5 miles apart, they both had to walk or score rides from friends if they wanted to be together. Chris later told the investigators that he and Christina had made a plan for her to call him around 7:30 p.m. on Saturday night. But it doesn't seem like he was watching the clock very diligently. Chris wasn't home at 7:30. He was out partying with some guys Christina was not a fan of. Around 8 p.m., give or take, Chris got into his buddy Eric G's car to drive to the Kingsborough Party Store on 5 Mile Road to get some beer. Eric's girlfriend Debbie was with them. Chris wasn't worked up about the timing and the fact that he was running late. He thought he would likely run into Christina at a friend's house soon enough, as they both tended to hang out at the same places. Chris was a backseat passenger in Eric's car and was drinking, a beer in hand, as the vehicle drove westbound on 5 Mile Road toward the liquor store. Glancing out the window in the dark and drizzle, Chris saw a figure walking along the side of 5 Mile Road that he recognized. Chris said later that although the figure was wearing a sweatshirt with the hood pulled up and drawn tightly about the face so that it was hard to tell whether it was a male or female, he could tell right away. That's because it was his girlfriend, Christina. She was walking westbound on 5 Mile Road toward her home. When Chris saw her, she was a half-mile west of Telegraph Road heading toward Beach Daily. This was only about 0.7 of a mile from her house. She was going in the same direction that the car Chris was in was going. She had her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Chris said he didn't tell Eric to stop the car because he knew Christina would be mad at him because he was drinking and he'd smoked a couple of joints. She didn't approve of the guys that he was partying with that night, who she thought were a bad influence. A half mile or so up ahead, the car pulled into its destination, the Kingsborough Party Store at 5 Mile and Beach Daily. Chris, Eric, and Debbie got out. Chris ditched his beer, bought some beer for his friends who didn't have ID, and then told them to go ahead without him. He was going to wait there for Christina to walk up. She should be arriving any minute. But she didn't arrive. Chris stayed outside the liquor store until it became apparent that Christina was not coming. That was totally perplexing since he had just seen her walking a half mile away. He started walking, stopping in at all the places she could have gone. Her friend Lisa B's house, whose house Chris knew she would have gone to first if she were upset about something. She wasn't there. Next, he tried her friend Renee D's, where she and Chris hung out often. Renee's sister Linda was coming out of the house when Chris walked up, and she said Christina wasn't there. Chris continued to Sparky's in case she was at the arcade there. She wasn't. Chris wasn't worried yet and squeezed in 2 games of Pac-Man before moving on. He stopped in at the home of his buddy named Mike A., who lived at 25048 5 Mile, right where Chris had seen Christina walking. Mike and his wife Sonia confirmed that Christina had been at their house earlier looking for Chris. She had stopped in around 7 after looking for Chris at his sister's house across from hers. Then she walked a mile to Mike and Sonia's, and she was upset to learn that she had just missed Chris, who had stopped in at their place before that. She stayed at Mike and Sonia's for less than an hour and talked with them about Chris and the problems she had with some of the lifestyle choices he was making. Then she left, setting off around 8 to walk home in the dark, telling Sonia and Mike she was going home to wait for Chris to call. Chris talked to everyone he could think of. Finally, after 10 p.m., he went home. He wasn't supposed to call the Castiglione house after 10, but he did anyway. He dialed the number and the Castigliones were out, but he spoke with a family friend, Pat, who was staying there. She said Christina wasn't home. He called back 2 more times, with the last time being around 11. This time, Pat yelled at him to stop calling, so he did. He decided Christina must have gone out with some other friends, and he went to bed. The next morning around 9:30, Beatrice Castiglione called Chris's house looking for her daughter. She hadn't come home the night before, and Beatrice was worried. Christina's mom, Beatrice, called everyone she could think of with no luck. Finally, Christina's parents reported her missing to Redford Township police on Sunday afternoon, when no one had seen or heard from her for about 16 hours. It was totally out of character for Christina to do this. She was typically conscientious and reliable. She had no reason to walk away from her family, and her mom felt strongly that she would not have done so. And Christina had taken virtually nothing with her. Redford Police Department Sergeant John Crete, who headed up the missing persons investigation, and Officer Schroeder went to the Castiglione home and collected a photo of Christina from her mom. They searched her room and learned that she'd left home without her purse, wallet, money, and her knife that Chris had given her for protection after a disturbing incident a month earlier. Her mom said she'd likely taken her driver's license, though, since it was missing. The officers gathered a description of what Christina was last seen wearing from her mom and Chris and started their investigation into the missing teen. Chris started staying at the house of his sister, who lived right across the street from the Castigliones, so he could be there in case she came home, but she never did. A press release was issued by the Redford police on March 22nd. It advised the public that they were looking for a missing young woman and gave Christina's description. She was a 19-year-old Caucasian, 5 foot 8 inches tall, 130 pounds, with brown, shoulder-length curly hair. She had a small scar on her lower lip, and she was wearing blue jeans with holes in them, a black T-shirt, a maroon jacket, and a gray hoodie. She had red and white sneakers on her feet and a silver Redford Union High School class ring, a silver bracelet, and a silver digital watch. On Sunday morning, March 20th, between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m., less than 12 hours after Christina went missing from 5 Mile Road, 6 inches of snow fell in southeast Michigan. On March 22nd, the police interviewed Chris at length at the station. He gave them all the details of his search for Christina that Saturday night and admitted he had lied to them initially. He had told the police that on Friday night he and Christina had gone to a party. Well, that wasn't true. Christina had lied to her mom and told her she was spending the night at a friend's. Instead, she and Chris spent the night at a motel, and they had sex in the morning before checking out. They did some errands for Christina's mom, and they parted ways around 2 o'clock on Saturday. And Chris had seen her alive and well, walking on 5 Mile Road toward her home that night. Where had she gone? The first thing the investigators did was run down Chris's story and determine whether he was telling the truth. After all, Christina had left her home to go find him, according to both her mom and her friends, Mike and Sonia, who saw her. The question was whether they had ever met up. But Chris was seen by plenty of people, not in the company of Christina, but looking for her. He had talked to her friend Lisa, Renee's sister Linda M., Mike and Sonia, people at Sparky's, and others about how he couldn't find Christina. When he got home at 10, his mom saw him at their house, and he told her he couldn't find his girlfriend. His mom and dad went out, and when they got home at 1, Chris was still there and still hadn't gotten a call from Christina. He didn't have access to a car, as his parents had taken the family vehicle that evening. And Chris was still at home on Sunday morning when Mrs. Castiglione called, distraught with worry. Deciding that it appeared that Chris was being truthful, the police started investigating on the assumption that Chris had indeed seen Christina walking on 5 Mile Road sometime between 7:30 and 8:30 on Saturday night. They talked to the other people in the car with Chris, Eric and his girlfriend Debbie. Eric hadn't seen anyone walking on the roadside, but passenger Debbie had, observing a dark figure hitchhiking on the westbound side of the road on the way to the Kingsborough party store where they ended up. She noted she did not see this same figure on the way back to Eric's house, where she and Eric arrived at 8:20. Members of the Redford Township Police Department canvassed the homes and businesses in the area where Christina was last seen. They stopped in at the party store with her photo, but the clerk on duty was certain she hadn't been in there that evening. They interviewed Mike and Sonia, whose house she'd been at. The couple told the investigators that Christina had been upset that night because she couldn't find Chris, and no doubt she was not thrilled that he had blown off their 7:30 call time. She also was unhappy because he had almost gotten into a bar fight the week before. Hi guys, as DNA ID has grown, I've gotten busier than I ever imagined. I just don't have time to do some of the things I used to do, and that includes cooking. You've heard me talk about delivery meal kits before, and those are genuinely great. But let's face it, sometimes you're not up for slicing and dicing. You just need to get a healthy and fulfilling meal in front of your family ASAP. That's where Factor comes in. Factor is a meal delivery kit, but everything is pre-made and pre-portioned for you. Factor's restaurant-quality meals are ready to heat and eat whenever you are. It's that simple. All Factor's meals are chef-crafted and dietitian-approved. And we're not talking basic meat and potatoes. You'll have over 35 different options a week to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and more. If you're looking for more than dinners, Factor offers snacks, smoothies, midday bites, over 55 nutrition-packed add-ons to round out your day. Get as much or as little as you need by choosing 6 to 18 meals per week. And don't worry, it's flexible. You can pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. Factor takes the stress out of dinner and overall is less expensive than takeout. Sign up and save. Head to factormeals.com/DNA50 and use code DNA50 to get 50% off. That's code DNA50 at factormeals.com/DNA50 to get 50% off. Now is a good time to discuss who Christina was and what was going on in her life. Christina Lynn Castiglione was born to parents Cristoforo and Beatrice in Livonia, Michigan on March 8, 1964. She had a sister, Anna, who was 2 years her senior. In 1973, the Catholic Italian family had moved to their current home at 15438 MacArthur in Redford, and Christina attended public schools in the small town. She graduated from Redford Union High School in 1982, where she wasn't a standout student but was very sporty, both playing sports and helping coach younger kids in town basketball and volleyball leagues. Christina also liked to tinker with mechanized vehicles like cars and bikes. She was working on fixing up an old Mustang, but she'd sold it just a week earlier because the insurance payments were too high for her budget. Christina wasn't a girly girl. She didn't wear makeup and she didn't stress about her outfits or hair. Several people called her a tomboy. She was a tall girl at about 5'8" and 130 pounds. Christina was described by her small, close-knit group of friends as a very friendly and cheerful young woman, but someone who was not super outgoing. She preferred to do things in small groups rather than be in crowds of people. In school, she generally stayed away from large parties and school dances. She wasn't the type to go to bars and drank only moderately. Drugs weren't really a part of her life. She smoked pot very occasionally with her boyfriend Chris, but she didn't really approve of the stoner lifestyle. She didn't hang out with kids who were trouble either. She didn't really have any drama in her life, other than a tense relationship with her dad, whom she considered to be domineering, and they butted heads over what she termed his controlling nature. Chris explained it to detectives as, quote, "He's Italian and he's kind of like, he doesn't like any of Christina's friends, you know?" Christina couldn't afford to move out of her parents' home, so for the time being, she lived with them. After high school, Christina wasn't sure what she wanted to do. She took a position as a temp, someone who gets contracted out for various jobs. She worked for a temp agency called Somebody Sometime. 3 months before her death, the agency had situated her at Detroit Edison, where she worked as a clerical worker. She kept to herself and performed her job adequately. But she was somewhat dissatisfied with this situation. Her mother said that Christina was in a quandary about what to do with her life. She was on contract with Edison for another few months, but also had started the process of enlisting in the Army. She wasn't 100% sure she wanted to go that route, but she had undergone the requisite testing and application process to get the ball rolling in case she decided to move forward. She had passed her tests and was in touch with an Army recruiter. Christina's boyfriend Chris was 6 years older than Christina, and they were quite different. Chris had had issues with hard drug use in the past. Christina knew this and was helping him rehabilitate himself. She had zero tolerance for the stuff he'd been into, and Chris cleaned himself up for her, but was unemployed and still figuring things out. Chris and Christina had only recently become sexually active. Christina did not have a long history of relationships and had seriously dated only 2 guys before Chris. One was named Ted J., who she met while they both worked at Glassman Oldsmobile. They went out for about a year, but weren't intimately involved, and she broke up with him because she said he was boring. They remained friends, and he knew Chris as well. Her boyfriend before Ted was a guy named Louis, with whom she also stayed friends. Christina had no history whatsoever of running away or going off the grid. When she vanished in a distance of a half-mile, her family and friends knew immediately that something was wrong. But no one could figure out where she had possibly gone. She was last seen on a busy roadway on a Saturday night, and then she evaporated. Christina's friends and family all agreed that she was not a meek person and would not have been cowed by a stranger into going off with him unless he wielded a weapon. But she was known to hitchhike, and in fact relied on hitchhiking to get places now that she had no car. Had she gotten into a vehicle with someone she knew? And if so, where was she? Christina's family printed up a set of flyers and papered the area where she was last seen with them, with a large photo of a smiling Christina and the number for the Redford Township Police. Lots of calls were received by that agency from tipsters who had seen Christina on the news and believed they'd sighted her at local establishments, walking along highways, crying at a gas station, nervously pacing at a bus station. Police checked into them all. They also checked many dumpsters in the area after receiving a call from Penny, a neighborhood psychic who said she felt vibes that Christina was put in a dumpster. The police had Michigan Bell put a monitor on the Castiglione home phone in case a call came in from Christina or a ransomer. They went through Christina's address book, checked her banking records, reviewed personal mail and cards in her room. They talked to her boss at Edison, Ralph Dage. He said Christina would never have just skipped work without calling in. She did her job and met expectations, and she didn't have any workplace drama. Police spent a lot of time on a lead that proved to be a red herring. A motorist on Annapolis and Inkster roads had seen a young woman on Sunday evening between 6 and 7 p.m. and called it in. This young woman attracted the attention of the driver, named Roderick, and his girlfriend May, because she was standing at the intersection almost naked, clothed only in panties and orange socks. Furthermore, her wrists were tied together behind her back with black cord. She was white, 5'8" tall or so, of medium build with large breasts, and had shoulder-length brown curly hair. Roderick and May drove to a payphone to call police, but by the time they got back, the young woman was gone. Christina's mom said she usually wore white underpants, but she had one beige pair, and she did have socks like that. At the cops' request, she searched the house, and the beige underwear were missing. A police statement said, quote, "We are not ruling out the possibility that the incidents may be related." Roderick and May were shown a photo of Christina, but they couldn't be certain that it was she they'd seen, although she looked similar. Another witness came forward who also saw the woman dressed only in panties and orange socks. This person said the young woman was getting into a green Cadillac with rust on the rear. Quite a bit of work was done to run down that vehicle, but this incident was never connected to Christina's case, and the underwear-wearing young woman was not Christina, as we shall see. Christina's mom and Chris also relayed a story that Christina might have a stalker. After getting off the bus from work, Christina typically hitchhiked from 5 Mile and Telegraph to 5 Mile and MacArthur. About a month before her disappearance, she accepted a ride from an older man in a white car who stopped and picked her up. She got in the car and the man offered her a joint, but she said no. He then propositioned her. She said no, and he asked if she wanted to watch him masturbating, and started doing so. Christina did not want to watch him masturbating, so she quickly got out of the car and memorized the license plate, which she shared with Chris. She continued to see this same driver and vehicle when she got off the bus from work, and he followed her a couple of times, including, on one occasion, all the way to her house. Chris had written down the plate number and now handed it over to the police, who found it was registered to Clinton Darrell W. Clinton had a record, but not for anything big. They questioned this pervert, but they couldn't link him to Christina's disappearance. They verified Clinton's alibi, which was that he was away all weekend at a bowling tournament in Dayton, Ohio. A week passed, with police spinning their wheels trying desperately and futilely to find Christina. Then on March 29th, the missing persons investigation came to an abrupt end. A call came into the Livingston County Sheriff's Office at 1:45 p.m., saying someone had found the body of a woman. Detective Robert Bizot was on the scene by 1:55, meeting with the caller, Ronald Y. He was in the company of a Dennis W., a Michigan Bell Telephone Company worker. Ronald Y. said that he had been looking for deer tracks on state-owned game land in Oak Grove in Cohocton Township. This was off Fisher Road, about a half-mile north of Fawcett. West of Fisher Road and 1/10 of a mile north of Fawcett, there was a small dirt trail. The body found by Ronald was lying just off that trail. Captain Duncan and Deputy Smith arrived in a crime scene van at 2 o'clock. Deputy Gallup also arrived, as did Detective Alan Steinaway. Deputy Gallup walked up the trail indicated by Ronald. He proceeded west and over a hillside in a lightly wooded area near overgrown open fields. She was lying on her back. Her mouth and eyes were open. The young woman was nude from the waist down. Her legs were about 18 inches apart, with the left leg bent a little bit. Her nylon coat was open and pulled off her upper arms and down behind her, trapping her hands and wrists. Her hands were tucked underneath her hips. She was wearing a black t-shirt and a gray zip-front hoodie, but her bra was off and torn apart at the cups, the eyelets missing and knotted at the clasp area. The bra and her underwear with a sanitary pad still attached lay underneath her right shoulder. A sneaker and one white sock, as well as a pair of Levi's jeans, lay on the ground nearby. The other sneaker was found about 35 feet away. As for the second sock, this was holdback information, but it was the murder weapon. The young woman was strangled, her own sock tied around her neck in a granny knot. Investigators' notes say they theorized that she had been controlled by someone tightening the sock around her throat, forcing her to walk away from the roadway and into the woods. I had to wonder how on earth this went down. It's more than a little strange for a killer to make his prey take off her shoes so he can use her sock as a lethal weapon. But one thing the investigators learned was that Christina was in the habit of just slipping on her sneakers. Her Nikes were double knotted, but she kept them loose, the laces more fashion than function. Could Christina have tried to run from her killer and her shoes came off and he ran her down and grabbed the first thing that he could subdue her with? Perhaps his intent was to gag her with it. Maybe he even did gag her with it and then removed it to strangle her with. This is all speculation, but this is notably the first case I've come across in which a sock has been used to kill someone. Anyway, back to the crime scene. Deputies responding to the scene noted that the body had snow on it, but not under it. This from the police report by Detective Michael Smith, quote, "A melting process of the snow had taken place between the 20th of March and the 29th. However, some snow was still remaining. The snow was evident on top of the victim's body, up into the crotch area, and also in the venue of her elbow and the shoulder area," end quote. The snow was a reliable indication that this young woman had been lying in the woods prior to the time the snow had started, around 4:30 a.m. on March 20th. The snow had hidden her body from recreationists walking, snowmobiling, hunting, or hiking on the state land until the snow melted. However, her killer had notably disposed of her body in the open, with no concerns as to obscuring it. He could not have known that the snow would work in his favor. Livingston County deputies had received a bulletin from the Redford Township Police about a missing young woman from that town. Handwritten notes produced to me as part of the Livingston County Sheriff's Office case file say, "Clothing description fits for their missing girl." At 3 o'clock, Detective Smith notified Officer Schroeder of the Redford Police of their find, 50 miles from where Christina Castiglione had last been seen. Detective Schroeder arrived at the scene at 4:05 p.m. He noted the silver digital watch and bracelet and ring that the dead young woman was wearing and knew it was Christina. It was time to talk to her parents. The Castigliones came down to the morgue and identified their daughter. Beatrice told a local reporter in a 1987 interview, quote, "My husband and I identified the body, but it didn't exactly look like her. She'd been beaten and her face was swollen. We knew the coroner and he told us he was pretty sure it was her. I guess I didn't want to believe it was her at first, and her death hasn't been easy to accept, but I guess it was her. My husband just laid on the couch and spoke very little during the 10 days she was missing until she was found. We were very close, and I feel like I've lost a part of me." Beatrice and Cristoforo drove out to the place where their daughter's body was found, something I imagine many parents would feel the urge to do. and after Christina was buried, they visited her grave every Sunday. A check of the pockets of Christina's jacket and pants revealed that some things her family and friends said she would certainly have had on her person: her silver scroll cigarette case full of Cools, and her Pac-Man lighter, and her driver's license. They were all missing. When Christina was brought into the autopsy suite at 1:15 p.m. on March 30th, she still had the white sock around her neck. It was collected, as was her maroon coat, her gray hoodie, and her black REO Speedwagon t-shirt. Her left ring finger bore a silver ring, her right ring finger bore her silver class ring, and she had her watch on. All were retained. The body bag was also retained in evidence. Dr. George Rissonow was the pathologist who conducted the autopsy at the Michigan State Police Lab in Lansing. When he removed Christina's coat, which was holding her hands tightly behind her body, he observed brown matter covering her right hand. It was collected and determined to be feces. A fecal specimen was collected from Christina's lower colon for comparison. The body demonstrated lividity in the posterior, drying of the skin, and mottling, indicating early stages of decomposition. But remember that Christina was covered in snow, suggesting that she'd been lying on the frozen ground for 9 days. The frigid environment made it difficult to determine from the physical signs exactly when she died, but the snow indicated that it was shortly after she went missing. The cause of death was partial physical asphyxiation due to strangulation, but the sock had left minimal visible injury to her throat, just a slightly discolored indentation. I say partial because it wasn't clear to the pathologist that the strangulation would necessarily have killed her. She had minimal petechiae and had actually died from a combination of asphyxiation and exposure. She had very little trauma to her body, just some superficial abrasions, scratches on her face, chest, and lower right thigh. Scrapings were taken of dirt on the soles of both Christina's feet and fingernail scrapings and clippings from both her hands. Blood samples were collected for toxicology testing, which came back negative for drugs and alcohol. No evidence of trauma was detected in Christina's anal or vaginal regions. A rape kit was done and oral, anal, and vaginal swabs collected. Semen was found on the swabs from both Christina's vaginal and anal cavities on her right hand and on her jeans. Blood typing on the semen determined that it was from someone with blood type A. However, Christina's boyfriend Chris was blood type A as well, and he told police that he and Christina had sex on the morning of the day she disappeared. Christina was buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Police attended and photographed her funeral and collected and reviewed the guest book. The scene where Christina's body was found was carefully worked by investigators from the Livingston County Sheriff's Office. They collected a black comb on the ground, a 50-cent piece, a Jack Daniels bottle found 14 feet off Fawcett Road, and a soil sample from underneath Christina. The entire crime scene was extensively photographed, and aerial photos were taken from a small plane flown overhead. Detective Edwin Moore also sketched the crime scene using measurements taken by other investigators. Detective Bizot separated Ronald and Dennis, the men who had called the police about the body in the woods, in order to interview them without tainting their statements with knowledge of what the other was saying. Dennis said he was in the area in the course of his work for the phone company, and Ronald came up to him and said he was there hunting and he'd found a girl's body in the woods. He seemed shaking and nervous. Dennis used his phone company equipment to call the authorities, and together they waited in the parking area at the trailhead. Ronald gave the following statement. He had gotten laid off from his construction job the week before, so he decided to go fishing and hunting that day. He fished at Kent Lake in the morning, and then he went to the trail off Fisher Road, where he had found deer the previous fall. He saw the phone company guy there, and then he saw 2 deer walking into the woods and began tracking them. He walked along the pine tree line down the hill. Looking around for the deer, he saw the body of a white woman lying on the ground. He didn't go anywhere near her because he could tell immediately that she was dead. He returned to his truck and located the telephone worker Dennis and told him what he'd found. Together, they called the sheriff's office. Investigators from the Livingston County Sheriff's Office canvassed neighbors residing in the area of the crime scene. It wasn't a thickly settled area, but there were some houses near the intersection of Fisher and Fawcett. The place was remote enough that it was unlikely that someone drove through randomly. For that reason, police assumed they were looking for someone familiar with the area, which is why they meticulously canvassed all the residents. They spoke with a Lawrence Henry Smith, a UPS driver who lived in the area with his family. He was a regular jogger but had seen nothing. But his son, a minor, had been coming home from work on Sunday, March 20th, and he'd seen a car parked on southbound Fisher Road right near the trail where Christina was found. The car was a 1972-ish baby blue Pinto with rust on the left rear quarter panel. He didn't see any people. They spoke with Alan Langerdorfer and his wife, who operated a convenience store right near the crime scene. They hadn't noted anything unusual at all. The phone company guy, Dennis, hadn't observed anything out of the ordinary, and neither had any of the other locals. One woman said she saw a car parked right there with a man and a woman in it, but she wasn't sure when that was and couldn't really provide any other information. The investigators received many, many tips from callers regarding vehicles seen near the dump site. Unfortunately, most of them said things like, "Sometime in the past couple weeks I saw a gray car parked there with 2 people in it." It was almost impossible to run this type of lead down. Livingston County deputies quickly admitted they had, quote, no idea who had killed Christina Castiglione. Christina's boyfriend Chris was interviewed again on April 1st. He was read his Miranda rights and agreed to give blood and saliva samples for blood typing. As we heard, his blood type was A, the same as the semen found in the rape kit and on Christina's hand and jeans. Chris told the detectives that Christina was his best friend. They saw each other pretty much every day. They really didn't argue, and no, he never got physical with her. Things were good between them, so good that they had talked about her joining the army and getting stationed somewhere warm and him going along. Chris didn't know of any problems Christina had with anyone. As for him, no, he never borrowed anybody's car, and he didn't have any drug deals gone wrong, and he didn't owe anybody any money. Police considered this angle, that Christina had been killed because of something Chris was mixed up in. But the reality was he wasn't really mixed up in much of anything. Here is a snippet from Chris's interview in which he denied ever being in Livingston County that night and ever being in a car with Christina that night. "Okay, did you kill Christina?" "No," laughs nervously. "Do you know anybody that did?" "No, I wish I did." "Do you have any knowledge about how she could come up missing?" "No, I don't." "Any idea where she would go if she couldn't find you? Where would she normally go?" "She would have gone home," he said. Chris agreed to take a polygraph, which he passed. Police confirmed with the proprietor at the Kingsborough party store that he had bought beer that night, just as he said, around 8:30 p.m., and that Christina was not with him. They just didn't have anything on Chris. Another angle police investigated extensively was the occupants of or those present at the house where Christina had last been seen and appeared to be walking from when Chris saw her. This was the 5 Mile Road rental house of Mike and Sonia A. You'll remember that Mike and Sonia told the investigators that Christina had been at their home and left around 8 p.m. to walk home. Police did a lot of digging to see whether Christina had actually ever left that house. They learned that Mike had a sketchy cousin with the nickname Lips, who had recently had $200 in cash stolen from him and possibly had it out for Chris and Christina, thinking they took it. Several people said that both Lips and Mike had tempers and could fly off the handle. But there was no sign that anything had happened to Christina at the house, and Chris was certain he had seen her walking away from it. She had been found wearing the clothes that he had described after seeing her hitchhiking that night. That avenue of inquiry fizzled. One of Christina's closest friends was a woman named Lisa B. Christina babysat for Lisa, a young mother, and the two became extremely close to the point that Christina and Chris would socialize with Lisa and her husband Mark. Christina told Lisa her family and relationship problems and confided in her. Lisa said that on the night of March 19th around 7:30, Christina called and asked to come over. She seemed upset about something. Mark told her they were going out to dinner but to come by later. She never came over, but Chris called Lisa's house looking for her at 10:20, and Beatrice called the next morning around 9, frantic with worry. Lisa described Christina to the police as someone who was cautious, had a good head on her shoulders, a kind and nice person. Lisa had no idea who could have killed her, saying Christina hadn't told her about anyone she had any problems with, except one guy I'll get into in a bit. Police expanded the circle of people to be interviewed, trying to talk to everyone who knew Christina or who was even remotely connected to her, trying to figure out whom she might have gotten into a car with. They talked to all the guys that Chris was partying with that night, Eric, Robert C., Phil S. They talked to Christina's ex-boyfriend, Ted, who said that Christina was great and they parted on good terms. Her ex, Louis, now worked on an oil rig in Alaska, so he had a pretty good alibi. They talked to people she went to high school with, the parents of teams she coached. Police interviewed Debbie, the girlfriend of Eric, who was in the car with Eric and Chris that night. She saw the person hitchhiking on 5 Mile Road wearing a gray hoodie, but she didn't know who it was. She said it was right after the hitchhiker that Chris brought up his girlfriend Christina, which made sense given his story that it was her that he'd seen. Debbie had also noted a black Blazer in the area with jacked up large tires, turning right onto Pomona Street next to Mike and Sonia's house. Police made a note of this and any potential suspects who might drive a black Blazer. They spoke to people Christina had worked with at Glassman Oldsmobile. One of these was Mark G. He said on Thursday, March 17th, around 9 o'clock p.m., he had picked up Christina and Chris hitchhiking near Lawson's Party Store on 5 Mile near Telegraph. He dropped them off at 9 Mile and Telegraph at a motel. He never dated Christina, he said, and he didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. He agreed to take a polygraph, and he passed. 2 guys the police looked into were Christina's sister Anna's boyfriend Stephen F. and his cousin Donald R. The 2 had gotten into a fight with bar patrons while passing out missing persons flyers about Christina at the Dukes of Windsor bar before her body was found. Stephen had a record for carrying a concealed knife, assault and battery, felonious assault, felonious driving, robbery, and restricting arrest. Of course, Stephen and Christina knew each other, and police felt Christina might have accepted a ride from Stephen and Donald. Both of these guys were interviewed and took polygraphs and passed. And since they were seen passing out missing persons flyers for her, it seemed unlikely that they had killed her. They interviewed a guy named David Lee R., who had met Christina and Chris at Mike and Sonia's a few times. David raised eyebrows because he'd made some remarks that it was no wonder Christina got killed, seeing as she hitchhiked like she did. He admitted to police that he had considered dating her, and he had a cut over his eye that made him look extremely suspicious. But the cut turned out to have happened when he got hit by a beer by a drunken friend named Randy. David agreed to submit saliva, hair, and blood samples and take a polygraph. He, too, passed. And on and on. The list of names in the case file is hundreds of names long. By August 1983, police had checked 80 tips from anonymous callers, interviewed 20 persons of interest, a term they used loosely, and polygraphed upwards of 25 people. I will say here that the police relied very heavily on polygraphs, subjected a lot of people to them, and appeared to give the results quite a lot of credence. None of the polygraph results revealed any deceptive patterns from any of these persons, and many of them had alibis as well. Police began to second-guess their original assumption that Christina knew her killer. It was looking more and more like Christina was picked up by a random stranger who had raped and killed her. As soon as the news of Christina's murder spread in March 1983, the thoughts of both police and civilians harkened back to a murder that had taken place the previous year. The Kimberly Louiselle case had startling similarities to Christina's. Kim was a 16-year-old high school sophomore from South Lyon in Oakland County. She was 5'7", 125 pounds, brunette, like Christina. Kim was last seen alive on March 20th, 1982, a year minus a day before Christina disappeared. Kim was dating a guy named Robert B., who went by Bob. Bob's family lived at 17190 Centralia in Livonia. Kim had dropped out of South Lyon High School and defied her parents, William and Joanna, hitchhiking to see Bob on March 18th. She stayed at his home for 2 days. On March 20th, Bob went to work. Bob's cousin Rick W., who was staying at the house, answered the phone when Kim's mom called looking for her, and Rick learned that Kim had not gotten permission to stay with the family. Rick told the 16-year-old she needed to go home. Kim called her parents and said she was coming home. This from a report of a police interview. Quote, Michael B., this is Bob's brother, walked her down to the corner where she got a ride with a friend of Rick's named Michael McW., who was driving a multicolored Gremlin. End quote. This was at 6 Mile and Centralia. Mike B. watched Kim get into the distinctive car driven by a dude he knew, Michael McW., and drive away. Kim's mom, Joanna, called the next day asking where Kim was. When she realized no one knew, she reported Kim missing. When police came calling, Mike B. reported that he saw Kim get into the Gremlin owned by Michael McW. An interview with that driver indicated that he had dropped Kim off at a gas station at 8 Mile and Merriman in Livonia. This guy, Michael McW., passed a lie detector test, and also someone had seen Kim after she was dropped at the gas station. Kim had headed to a payphone and called around to some friends asking for someone to pick her up. While she was on the phone, a relative of Kim's drove by. She didn't stop because she was late for an appointment, but she saw Kim, whom she didn't know needed a ride. There are some reports that Kim was seen getting into a vehicle around 6:30 p.m., wearing a faux fur jacket and jeans. Others say she was walking on the road hitching a ride. But no one knows for sure. What we do know is that Kim never made it home. She was reported missing by her family the next day. Kim remained missing for nearly a month before her body was found nude in a thicket on April 14th by a couple walking their dog. This was in the Island Lake Recreation Area in Green Oak Township, about 20 miles from where she'd last been seen. An autopsy showed she'd been raped, beaten, and strangled. This wasn't released at the time, but Kim was strangled with a ligature, something firm that was about an inch wide. The implement was not found with her body. None of Kim's clothes or personal possessions were found in the immediate vicinity either. However, a pair of high heels was found in a field not too far away from Kim. Whether or not these shoes were Kim's has never been determined. Police attempted to get fingerprints off them with no luck. One thing was found with Kim's body, though, something plucked from the surrounding environment that had been used on her. I've been asked not to discuss it in detail. That item would become very important nearly 40 years later. A rape kit was done at Kim's autopsy. Vaginal swab slides showed the presence of 3 sperm heads, indicating that Kim had possibly been raped. Kim's autopsy results were confusing to the police because the pathologist inspecting her stomach contents observed that she'd eaten scrambled eggs shortly before she died. But the family she was staying with, Bob's family, said she didn't eat eggs before she left the house to hitchhike home that day. The fact that it appeared someone had been feeding her led to the theory that Kim might have been held alive for days, even a couple of weeks before she was slain. This also firmed up the theory that the sperm heads found inside her were the result of rape rather than something consensual. As you can hear, Christina's case was almost Kim's case all over again. They happened a year apart, almost to the day of each other. The cause of death was the same, and the 2 abduction sites were within 4 miles of each other. Like Christina, Kim's body was found in a wooded state game area after she was last seen looking for a ride home. The 2 victims were even buried in the same cemetery, Holy Sepulchre, in Southfield, Michigan, although Christina's family later moved her to Park Lawn. The Michigan State Police was the lead investigative agency on Kim's case, but the Livingston County Sheriff's Office did a lot of investigating too, since they believed the cases to be connected. Sergeant John Crete told the media, quote, "We have looked at the Louiselle case, and we will investigate the possibility that the 2 slayings are connected, but I want to emphasize that we don't have any evidence at this time to link the 2 incidents. We don't have any solid leads regarding Ms. Castiglione's disappearance or slaying," end quote. Police did investigate whether the 2 cases were connected. After Christina's murder, they re-interviewed some of the people connected to Kim to see if the 2 women had any associates in common. They found some overlap in the social circles the 2 young women moved in. For example, they pulled Kim's boyfriend Bob B. back in and re-interviewed him in May 1984. People had reported that he had violent tendencies and was possibly capable of killing women. But Bob denied having anything to do with either murder. He said he and Kim had dated for a year and he was, quote, bummed out by her murder. He did not know Christina and denied picking her up in his car, although he did admit to picking up female hitchhikers on the regular. However, Bob admitted to knowing Michael A. and his wife Sonia. Remember that Mike A.'s house was the one Christina was last seen at prior to starting her walk home. Bob B.'s brother Michael also knew Mike and Sonia A. When asked, he said he had seen Christina Castiglione with her boyfriend Chris L. at Michael and Sonia's house on occasion, but he never talked to them. Police also spoke to Rick W., the cousin of Bob and Mike, who had told Kim she needed to go home on that fateful day in 1982. Interestingly, Rick said he knew Michael A. pretty well and had been over to his house a number of times. Rick was shown photos of Chris L. and Christina, but he didn't recognize them. So this is all pretty crazy, right? We have 2 female murder victims, and people fairly close to each of them knew each other. There was, however, no solid nexus between the 2 women the police could find, and no specific person who had been seen with both of them. All they had was an unknown offender who continued to elude them. Police continued to operate on the theory that both cases were related, but they had no hard evidence to prove it. The Michigan State Police provided Detective Mike Smith of the Livingston County Sheriff's Office with a profile of Christina's killer that had been compiled by experts in the State Police Behavioral Science section. It posited that the killer was a white male between the ages of 25 and 30 years old. He lived, worked, or frequented the areas of the abduction site and murder scene. The victim was killed where she was found. Quote, "We feel this is the subject's first homicide. The killing could have been accidental. That is, he lost control during the strangulation portion and she wound up dead. We feel the assailant most likely used a handgun to control the victim. The assailant is a loner and is most likely to live alone. He has poor interpersonal relationships, especially with women, and is not social. He does not date or have a girlfriend. He might have sexual dysfunction when with a female. He has an arrest record for minor offenses. Police may have had contact with him on prowler complaints or window peeping. He has a low-paying job which requires little interaction with other people. He likely employs pornographic materials. He is interested in bondage. And he is a cruiser. He will drive many miles looking for a victim. He probably gets his victim into the car by using a friendly approach and then produces the handgun to maintain control. He will kill again." End quote. Or maybe he already had. In June 1983, the investigation was going strong, but was branching out past Christina's inner circle and known acquaintances because no suspects had emerged from those groups. A reward of up to $2,000 was announced for anyone providing information leading to the arrest and conviction of Christina's killer. Detective Sergeant John Crete said they had checked into 40 to 50 pieces of information and, quote, "We've interviewed 15 to 20 people, but we haven't come up with anything. About half the people we interviewed agreed to take polygraphs, but we don't consider any of the people we interviewed to be prime suspects in the slaying. We could use some help from the public in solving this case, and we're hoping we can generate some new leads through the secret witness program." End quote. Township Police Chief Michael Manoog also told the Detroit News on June 20th, 1983, quote, "The investigation is now at a standstill, and we have no further promising leads to investigate." In August, the Detroit Free Press ran a long article about how frustrated police were with the investigation, calling them stymied. The article says, quote, "Police now have no better idea of what led to Christina's death and who killed her than they did in March when her body was discovered. We have not had much luck on this case so far," said Livingston County Detective Robert Bazat, heading up the investigation. End quote. Police widely distributed photographs of Christina in the area where she was last seen and near where her body was found. As Detective Bazat said, nobody saw anything. The investigator told several interviewers over the years that this case especially bothered him. He kept a picture of Christina on his desk next to his own wife and children. He felt that invested in it. The investigators backburnered the theory that Christina had known her assailant and expanded the scope of their search for her killer by looking at area's sex crimes. They contacted the Michigan State Police in Lansing for a review of sex-motivated offender files in Wayne and surrounding counties. And they gathered reports from other area law enforcement agencies with regard to rapes, assaults, exhibitionists, stalkers, peepers, lewd crank callers, and so on. And there were lots and lots of them. Some of my favorites. A patrol car pulled in behind a car parked on the side of the road belonging to Paul Robert O. Paul was lying down in his car, and the police officer observed numerous beer bottles in plain sight. There was mud all over the seats, dashboard, and interior door panels. Several pairs of women's panties, bras, and pantyhose lay around, and more were found under the right front seat. Some of these were freshly wet and muddy. Paul had no explanation for the mud and wet clothing, so the officer felt some kind of sexual assault might have taken place. The police searched Paul's car for any signs of Christina's driver's license, her Pac-Man lighter, and her silver cigarette case. Nothing was found, and this guy proved to have no connection to Christina, but just to be a total weirdo who was probably up to something pervy. Then there was Jack Thomas Davis, a Michigan State Police sergeant arrested by the Ottawa County, Michigan Sheriff's Office for breaking and entering. A Michigan law enforcement bulletin dated August 1992 says when Davis was arrested, he was dressed in camouflage and, quote, "Found on his person or in the bag he was carrying was a .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun and a .38 caliber revolver. He also had 5 pieces of nylon rope, pry bars, 4 canisters of nerve gas, flex cups, condoms, latex gloves, masks, 2 rolls of medical tape, and extra rounds of ammunition. In his GMC extended cab pickup were recovered 2 more guns, more masks, several pairs of shoes and boots, more pry bars and burglar tools, and a police scanner. The arrest of Davis ended up clearing close to 60 crimes in 22 different jurisdictions. The state police sergeant was a one-man crime wave. Davis failed a polygraph as to whether he'd been involved in any crimes against people as well as property crimes. He didn't kill Christina, but you can see why he was looked at. They looked at a guy named Lester Edward B., who worked at the Standard service station at 9 Mile and Beach Daily, very near where Christina was last seen. This guy came onto the investigators' radar because in August 1983, he'd been called into the Ann Arbor police for following a female jogger in his car. He said the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Okay. They asked him if he had an alibi for the night Christina went missing. Lester sounded really guilty because he said that to the best he could recall, on Saturday, March 19, 1983, he left his house between 8 and 9 p.m. and went to the Speedway gas station at 5 Mile and Beach Daily in Redford, literally the intersection Christina was walking toward when she vanished. From there, Lester said he went to a couple of bars. Further, Lester admitted to picking up a female hitchhiker at one point on 9 Mile at Telegraph. He denied having anything to do with Christina, and he passed a polygraph, but dude was sus, no doubt about it. Another guy the police had to look at because he was reputed to be in the area was James Mitchell DeBartolome. DeBartolome was a sexual sadist and rapist, murderer, kidnapper, counterfeiter, and woman hater who committed crimes in at least 7 states in the early 1980s. The Secret Service tipped off Detective Creed in January 1984 that DeBartolome had been found with some handwritten notes referencing the name Chris or Christina. They had a location for him in Greensburg, Pennsylvania on March 19, 1983, but they couldn't place him in Michigan. He didn't kill Christina, but was exactly the type of violent offender who had to be vetted by Michigan authorities. If you're interested in hearing more about James DeBartolome, I covered him in my episode on Virginia Freeman. The police also investigated every tip, however outlandish. One guy called in a tip that he overheard 2 guys named Tom and Carl in a bar on 8 Mile saying, quote, "If that other bitch would have taken the money, we wouldn't have had to do her. And I wonder if that snow is keeping her cold down in hell. She shouldn't have been hitchhiking if she didn't want to make some money." Another tipster claimed that Christina had acted as a lookout on a B&E a year before she was killed, and then she got drunk or high and started talking about it at a party. So the burglar guys either killed her or arranged to have her killed. It was unlikely, but like all other tips, could not be ignored. Okay, let's talk about some real suspects. One of these was a guy very well known to Christina named Donald L. The police had learned from several people close to Christina that she had been raped by Donald when she was 13. Christina's parents, Beatrice and Cristoforo, were godparents to Donald and his wife Grace's child. The families were close ever since Beatrice and Grace had met at work. Police sat down for an interview with Donald's wife Grace, treading lightly because they weren't certain whether she knew about the rape allegation against her husband. Detective Steinaway's report says, quote, "At the time this interview was begun, the detectives involved in this investigation considered Grace's husband Donald to be a prime suspect," end quote. Grace told the investigators that she had been very close to Christina and became a confidant when Christina wanted advice about love and sex and relationships. Grace knew all about Christina's personal life. She knew that Christina and Chris were sexually active and that Christina had not taken that decision lightly. She had consulted Grace about whether to have sex with her previous boyfriend, but chose not to. Somewhat shockingly, Grace said that she sometimes let Christina and Chris meet at her house for sex. I doubt her quote-unquote best friend Beatrice Castiglione would have been too happy about that. Grace answered some questions about Christina's habits. She said Christina didn't have any connection to Livingston County, where she was found, other than that her cousin Mark lived there. Police had already interviewed him. She said Christina never hitchhiked alone, which we know was incorrect. She said the only person Christina had any problems with was the man who had picked her up and was masturbating in the car. Again, incorrect. Christina actually had problems with Grace's own husband, Donald. Grace knew that Christina didn't like Donald and went out of her way to avoid him, but she thought it was because of marital problems the two had, and that Christina was just being protective of Grace. Then the detectives asked Grace if she was aware that Christina had been raped when she was 13. She was shocked and asked who did it. Here is a quote from the police report. Informed that our investigation had revealed that Christina had been raped by Grace's husband Donald, Grace was visibly shocked and advised that she had known nothing of such an incident and further did not believe it possible since Donald had seemed so close to Christina. Moments later, she remarked, however, that she felt anything was possible now because she had never felt that Donald would have been capable of molesting her 1-year-old daughter, but that indeed had happened. She added that at the time of that incident, Donald was severely under the influence of alcohol and subsequently spent a month in jail before the charges were dropped as a result of an agreement in which Donald would seek the help of a psychologist, end quote. So Grace acknowledged that there was a slim possibility that Donald had done something to Christina. However, she quickly backtracked, saying that Donald had gotten his alcoholism under control and she didn't believe he would have done anything to hurt her. Furthermore, she knew for a fact that he was at home with her throughout the weekend. Her alibi for her husband was that on the night of Christina's abduction, they were both at home with the kids. She went to bed at 12:30 and he was still up. She was sure he did not leave the house. Donald was the next interview. It was brief. He said he was home all night on March 19th. He denied having anything to do with Christina's murder. He had no knowledge of her death or who might have been involved. He readily agreed to take a polygraph, which she passed. My polygraph results are redacted in the file, so I don't know whether they asked him whether he had raped Christina. But even if he did, he didn't kill her. Another guy who was placed on the suspect list was Marvin Glenn R. He came to the attention of detectives because he'd been charged with criminal sexual conduct in the first degree in an unrelated incident, and his mother lived about 1.5 miles east of the spot where Christina had been abducted. He also owned a black 1979 Plymouth Trail Duster, which police noted strongly resembled a Chevy Blazer, the kind of car seen right at the suspected abduction site on 5 Mile by Eric's girlfriend Debbie. Marvin was interviewed on March 29th by Detective Smith. He admitted that he'd been in the area of 5 Mile on Saturday night, March 19th, arriving at his girlfriend's residence there between 8:30 and 9. But Marvin was able to produce a donor card showing that his blood type was B positive. Remember that the samples taken from the vaginal swabs at Christina's autopsy were type A. Further, Marvin's girlfriend Melva kept a detailed diary that was clearly not made up in the eyes of detectives. It recorded that Marvin had arrived at her house at 8:30 p.m. on the 19th, and they went to the racetrack. There was no time for him to have abducted Christina. Marvin also cooperated and said he was happy to give blood, saliva, and hair samples and submit to a polygraph. Marvin was not their guy. Okay, so other than Donald L., there was one guy who was considered by several of the investigators on Christina's case to be the prime suspect for years and years. This was the guy who found her body in the woods, Ronald Y. Ronald checked many boxes for the investigators right off the bat. A confidential report by Detective Mike Smith of the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, dated September 20th, 1983, said that Ronald had not been eliminated as a suspect in the case. He was white, in his mid-30s, single, lived by himself. He had a military background, attaining the rank of Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps and serving in Vietnam and Okinawa. He was employed as a construction worker. He was an avid hunter and fisherman and was very familiar with the area where Christina was found. He had never been married and admitted he had never had a serious relationship with any woman. Quote, indications are that he does not particularly care for the company of women, end quote. Think back to the Michigan State Police profile of Christina's killer. Check, check, check. Ronald also resided just 10 to 12 miles from the abduction site in Redford Township, and his brother lived in Redford. Further, when the police had arrived on the scene and learned from Ronald that he was at the state game area where Christina was found because he was fishing and hunting that day, it was noted with emphasis that he had neither a fishing pole nor hunting equipment with him. Ronald didn't have much of a record. His only arrest was for carrying an open container in a motor vehicle, but he sure looked good on all the other killer criteria. Ronald agreed to be interviewed by police early on. He said that on Saturday, March 19th, he was off work and went to Kent Lake to go fishing. He stopped at a restaurant for lunch and returned to his house, arriving home around 3. He called his brother Don, and his brother and daughter came over around 4 or 5 and stayed until 6. After that, he was home alone. He might have called his best friend Tim, who lived in Sheboygan. On Sunday, he stayed home alone doing laundry and grocery shopping. Not much of an alibi. Police asked Ronald to tell him about the day he found Christina. He said on the 29th he decided to go to Oak Grove State Game Area at Fisher and Fawcett because the previous year he had bow hunted in that area with his brother Don and his friend Tim, and they'd had some luck finding deer. He took some binoculars and a walking stick and set out to see if he could track some deer. He'd been walking for a while when he found the dead woman lying in the thicket near some deer tracks. He was about 60 feet away from the body when he saw her legs sticking up. He didn't realize at first what he was looking at, and walked a little closer and could see that she was naked from the waist down. He did not touch or even go near the body at all. He walked quickly to his truck and drove down the road to call the police. But first he ran into the telephone guy, whom he asked to call the police. This was Dennis. Dennis dialed the phone, and Ron made the report. Ron said he had never heard anything about the girl missing from Redford until he found the body. He denied having anything to do with her murder, having any knowledge of Christina Castiglione, or of having sex with her. Initially, Ronald was very cooperative with investigators. He asked about taking a polygraph to prove that he was not involved. He allowed investigators to search his vehicle and his home. He agreed to submit to a blood test. However, after the initial interview, his cooperation ceased. 2 polygraphs were scheduled, and he didn't take either one. At the request of his attorney, a private polygraph was arranged and scheduled, and again, he did not show up. The police had to get a court order to require Ronald to submit to blood type testing, and the results showed that he had type A blood, the same kind as the semen lever. The police felt that given Ronald's blood type, lifestyle, lack of an alibi, familiarity with both scenes, and refusal to cooperate, he was fishy. They really had no way to exclude him since his blood type was consistent and there were no alibi witnesses for him. Ronald stayed in the sights of the investigators for decades. A 1987 Livingston County Press article states, quote, "Clues continued to point to the man who discovered the body," end quote. The article quoted the chief investigator for the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, who was now in charge of Christina's case, Robert Bizot, saying, quote, "There were several inconsistencies in his story that lead me to believe that he's got something to hide," end quote. For one thing, footprints showed that Ronald had lied when he said he hadn't gotten near the body in the woods. He had been within inches of it. And Ronald's refusal to cooperate with blood type testing and the poly was strange for a man who claimed he wanted to be cleared. Bizot said, quote, "We haven't been stuck on this guy, but in the back of my mind, I've always suspected him." Police never charged Ronald, but they kept tabs on him, and his name stayed at the top of their list, even after a 1986 accident rendered him a paraplegic and he moved out of state. Bizot told the Livingston County Press that he and the other Sheriff's Department detectives, as well as the Redford Township police, worked intensely on the case for the first 2 weeks after finding Christina's body, but few clues turned up. He estimated they talked to 200 to 300 people overall and compiled 50 or more profiles of serial killers and known sexual offenders. This case will never be forgotten, he said. John Creets said, quote, "Police never came up with a solid suspect." Beatrice Castiglione told the paper that Detective Bizot still kept a photo of Christina on his desk because, quote, "That's how bad he feels. We have no idea who could have killed Christina, and we're inclined to think what police think, that her killer was someone visiting the area and then left." She continued, "It would be nice if someone was arrested, but I don't know what good that would do. It wouldn't bring her back." A 1990 newspaper article with the headline, "Veteran Cop Haunted by Brutal Killings," covered Sergeant John Creed's crusade to solve Christina's case before he retired in 1992. He said, "The case eats away at me." He described the investigation as at a total standstill. This is a quote from him. "The Castiglione murder is linked to a similar incident that occurred a year earlier in Livingston County." He was referring here to Kim Louiselle's case. "But there are no suspects in either case. It could have been anybody driving on 5 Mile at 7:30 in the evening, and at this time they could be anywhere." In the mid-1990s, the Michigan State Police Post in Brighton assembled a task force to take on unsolved area cases from the early 80s. The task force was chaired by the Livingston County Prosecutor's Office and included investigators from Redford and the LCSO. 2 of the cases under review were Kim's and Christina's. It was hoped that publicity about the task force would drum up tips and leads. As part of his task force responsibilities, Detective Edwin Moore contacted the U.S. Department of Justice to enter Christina's case into VICAP in early 1996. Detective Moore listed the status of the investigation as currently suspended or inactive. They had simply run out of leads. Once it was in VICAP, the Castiglione case popped up as a good match to another case in the database, the Kim Louiselle case. An investigator on Kim's case, Eric Schroeder of the MSP, sent a memo in April 2002 to Detective Sergeant Larry Bonsack of the Michigan State Police, saying, quote, "The one constant that just keeps popping up is the Christina Castiglione case from Livingston County. I don't know if you have already compared these two cases. I'm assuming you have." They sure had. Everyone suspected they were committed by the same man. But who was he? In 2001, a law enforcement bulletin was issued to try to elicit leads in the Castiglione case. It stated that the state police crime lab had retained DNA evidence and that investigators were in the process of eliminating suspects through DNA testing. Detective Robert Michels was the lead investigator on the case. In 1993, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office had submitted some of the physical evidence from Christina's autopsy for DNA testing. The lab had managed to obtain both her DNA profile and that of her unknown assailant. The DNA of the same male was found in sperm fraction from a vaginal swab, sperm fraction from a rectal swab, and sperm fraction extracted from a fecal stain on Christina's jeans. By early December 2001, the STR DNA profile of this unknown male had been entered into the state's DNA database. It was hoped that now that the state mandated that arrestees and violent felons already incarcerated submit DNA samples to the database, perhaps a match would be made to Christina's case. Detective Michel's memo to now Undersheriff Robert Bizot said, quote, "We have lab tests pending on evidence and suspects for DNA comparison. Detectives Steinaway and Moore have helped fill in some of the gaps. I feel that I have a grasp on the case and feel good about the new law that is going into effect that requires felons and selected misdemeanors to submit DNA. Maybe this case will be solved by the time I retire." But soon, the 20th anniversary of Christina's murder came and went. The Livingston Daily Press and Argus ran an article revisiting the 20-year-old case in March 2003. Undersheriff Robert Bizot was quoted as saying, "The one case you don't resolve kind of haunts you because you know the guy is still out there." Of Kimberly's also unresolved case, Bizot said, "We always thought the cases could be related." Now that they had suspect DNA, in the mid-2000s there was a renewed push to rule in or rule out Ronald Y. once and for all. The investigators still believed that the man who had found Christina's body was still the likeliest suspect in her murder. In 2004, Undersheriff Bizot told the Livingston County Daily Press and Argus, quote, "We had his footprints within a foot of the body. We think he was leaving the scene and then found he could have been sighted in the area," end quote. Basically, Bizot felt that Ronald's story of what he was doing at the state game park that day just didn't make sense. He said he was there hunting and fishing, but he had no gear with him. Bizot suspected that actually, curious since there was no news about Christina being found, Ronald went back to the scene to see if Christina was still where he left her, and the telephone worker saw him, so he came up with a story for why he was there. They tracked Ronald down to Rhode Island, where he was now living. For reasons I won't go into that involved a Rhode Island Supreme Court ruling restricting police from executing search warrants to collect DNA samples, there was a lengthy delay in obtaining samples from Ronald. A Livingston County Sheriff's Office press release dated March 27, 2006 states, "The investigation into the murder of Christina Castiglione has been ongoing since her body was found. At that time, several suspects had been developed, including the person who found her body. With the advent of DNA technology, several people have been eliminated by the task force that is made up of the Livingston County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, Detroit Field Office, Redford Township Police, and Michigan State Police. The person who found her was never eliminated as a suspect." Finally, on March 3, 2006, special agents from the NCIS and Detective James Hazel from the Newport Police Department knocked on Ronald's door and asked to speak to him. They told him they were investigating a cold case from Michigan that occurred in 1983, and he said he remembered finding a body. Ronald agreed to give DNA samples on condition that he be informed of the results of the testing. Detective Hazel took the swabs and sent them by FedEx to Detective Michelle's back in Livingston County. DNA on the swabs was compared by the Michigan State Police Crime Lab against the unknown suspect sample from Christina. On March 16th, the Livingston County Sheriff's Department and NCIS were advised that Ronald's DNA sample did not match the unknown suspect sample found on Christina's person. Ronald was not the killer. Under Sheriff Bezat, who had most of his eggs in the Ronald did it basket, sent a letter to the NCIC in D.C. thanking them for their assistance in obtaining DNA from our, quote, chief suspect, Ronald Y. Bezat said, quote, although results were not what we expected, they did provide some closure to the Castiglione family. As the original investigator on this case, I believe it is solvable. This is the end of Part 1 of the Christina Castiglione case. Part 2 is available right now.